I discovered Steiner when I was in my early 20s, and I was at Oxford, at the university, in a highly intellectualized environment, which I hated, and
Studying
philosophy,
Yeah.
well, PPE, which includes philosophy. Philosophy was the thing that I was really interested in, keen on, and it was just agony for me. I hated it. It was Bertrand Russell and David Hume and every manner of reductionist thinker that you could imagine. And there was no real philosophy. And then I came across Steiner's work, and it was a godsend to me, because there was someone talking about thinking, but in a completely different way from the abstract, intellectualized thinking that's practiced in the universities. So for me, it was like, here is a new direction that I can go in. And the atmosphere in the 70s, the early 70s, when I was at university and struggling to find my way, was actually very anti-intellectual amongst those people who were seeking a spiritual path. So I was caught, in a way, between the arid intellectualism of Oxford and this rejection of intellectualism altogether in order to find a spiritual way. And Steiner was very significant for me at that moment in time, because he presented this alternative view of what thinking could be. So,
can you describe what that view is then? I mean, what was this alternative?
Well, one of Steiner's key books is The Philosophy of Spiritual Activity, or The Philosophy of Freedom, has those two different titles. And in that book he describes how thinking as an activity can be intensified so that it becomes a kind of dialogue with the world of spirit. And that seemed to me to be a path that I could follow.
But when you say world of spirit, I mean, that can sound pretty weird to some people. Are you talking about talking to spiritual beings, or what do you mean by the world of spirit?
Well, yes, I do. It may well sound weird, but I think that's the reality of it, yes. But of course, one's actually in a kind of inner dialogue with a world of thoughts, but the question is, what is the source of our thinking? Where do our thoughts come from? That's a living question, which I think anyone who's engaged with that question of what thinking really is obliged to ask.
I mean, most people would probably say that our thoughts come from our brain.
Most people probably would say that, yes. Well, I don't think that's actually correct. And even to the extent, of course, thinking is dependent on our having a brains. If you cut my head off, I wouldn't be able to think. But it doesn't mean that the source of thinking is material.
Yeah.
He set me on a path of actually looking into the history of consciousness, because I was very interested at that time, and for a long time since, still am, in the period in history when philosophy originated in ancient Greece. It was a period of maybe a couple of 100 years when philosophy was gradually emerging. And before that period, philosophy didn't exist. And people were living in the world much more from their feelings. If you read Homer, for example, the heroes in Homer are an incredibly emotional lot, and there's a sort of wild passion that moves through them and moves them to behave in the ways they behave. And with the birth of philosophy, there's this new kind of centre that emerges in the human being and human consciousness, which is very much head-based rather than lung and heart-based, which is what the heroes of Homeric Greece were. So, in fact, there's a Homeric hero, but in fact, the pre-philosophical culture of Greece was very much poetic and musical. Music and poetry were incredibly important for them. It's been called a song culture. And the poets were supposed to have been the repositories of wisdom. So when philosophers came along and said, no, we're the repositories of wisdom, it was a huge change, and it was as if the old dispensation was shattered at that point in time. So, for me personally, I've lived with that dichotomy, I suppose, between how to find a way of thinking and living with the world of thought, which is at the same time in touch with the world of feeling. And that led me right away from academic philosophy.
Yeah. Is that why you've chosen yourself to earn your living by gardening rather than by teaching philosophy? Is that your way of balancing head and hands?
Well, I suppose it is. I couldn't do philosophy all day, it would drive me nuts. But I also couldn't do gardening all day because I'd also go potty doing that. So it is definitely a very nice balance. And one of the things about gardening is that you can't really leave it for more than a week or so, because the garden just gets out of hand. So you're required to dedicate your life to it in a way, day after day after day.
It's a discipline, you mean?
It's a lovely discipline.
Yeah.
It's a lovely discipline, and there's no credit for it really. It's something that won't leave any lasting legacy for anyone else, because the garden will really fall apart within months of you stopping doing it.
But the work itself, I presume then that informs your philosophizing. It's not just a balance to it.
I garden with an empty head. I actually, what I love about gardening is that I don't think, and I really enjoy just being with the plants. So, yeah, people often think that it's a wonderfully contemplative activity, but it's contemplative in the sense that actually for me anyway, one just isn't thinking at all. One's just being.
Yeah. Would you like to say something about the importance of, and this is related to what we're saying, the importance of Goethe for Steiner? I mean, Goethe was interested in plants, and it was a big turning point for Steiner as a young man, wasn't it? Meeting Goethe's work.
It was crucial for his work, yes. Goethe was a huge influence on Steiner, and Steiner felt that he discovered a kindred spirit in Goethe, because he was approaching the natural world with an open heart, and not as an object to be studied and measured and quantified, but rather as a world that was still imbued with something sacred. I think Goethe was very aware of the sacredness of nature, and that's why he wanted to approach it in a different way, with empathy, rather than with objectifying consciousness.
But he still thought of himself as a scientist, didn't he, Goethe?
He certainly did, because he was interested in knowledge, and in a type of knowledge that was a direct knowing, really a perceiving, to actually see into the spiritual workings of nature. So he was focused much more on the world of qualities than of quantities, and much more on what could be perceived by each person as a human being, unaided by any scientific instruments. So for him, scientific instruments tended to get in the way of really seeing what was living in nature. That's why he's so much at odds with the approach of mainstream science.
And Steiner then would have felt the same way?
Well, for Goethe, the human being is the most exact instrument. If you can develop that instrument into an organ of deep perception, then of course you'll see more and more in nature, and that's what Steiner was able to do. He developed himself as a spiritual instrument, I suppose. So he was perceiving much more than most people are able to perceive in the natural world, and he extended that to invisible worlds, of course.
And was pointing to the fact that we all have this potential then?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's not so easy to develop it, though.
Yeah.
But, one just has to keep working at it, really on a daily basis.
What is your understanding of the key to working with it then?
Well, when I go into the gardens, I'm very aware that the first thing I want to do is, I see weeds and I see all sorts of things that need doing. So I want to get engaged with practical stuff, but I try to stop myself and just spend at least a few minutes with a plant and just observe it, just be with it. And there's something immensely centering and healing in doing that. And I feel it actually helps the rest of my day in the garden. You realise that there's a miracle there, really. And it's so easy to not see it.
Yeah. But that would be true perhaps of life altogether. We just simply don't notice things, do we? We take things for granted.
Yeah.
Not just plants.
That's absolutely true of life altogether. And one of the wonderful things about Goethe's scientific method is that you can apply it to every life situation. It's not just to do with our relationship to nature. It's not just to do with looking at plants or whatever. It's to do with how you relate to people, having an openness of heart, really. What happened for me in my personal journey was that I was hovering on the edges of philosophy, wondering what to make of it, and wondering also how it emerged and what really was going on with the emergence of philosophy in terms of the whole human history of consciousness. And reading Steiner, he wrote a brilliant book called The Riddles of Philosophy, where he talked about this period of the emergence of philosophy. And he spoke about how in the pre-philosophical world, people were living not only much more from their feelings and physically from the lungs and the heart, but also they were living with an awareness of being in a world that was interpenetrated with spiritual beings. So the gods and spirits were everywhere, at large in the world. And this is something that Steiner thought was extremely important that we bring into our awareness of our situation today, to understand that the mode of awareness that we have today is not necessarily complete, that we've actually lost an awareness of a lot of realms of being that people in antiquity were aware of. So I wanted to, I suppose, verify that for myself by going back in time into that pre-philosophical world. And I spent years and years wandering around in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, because those cultures were literate, so there's a lot of literature that you can look at. They also have incredibly rich imagery, and there's all the archaeological evidence and so on. And normally, I mean, the mainstream view is that the ancient Egyptians and Mesopotamians had a lot of strange beliefs and superstitions about this world of gods. Steiner's view was that no, that they're actually having experiences. And when I studied the literature and looked at the imagery and so forth, I could see that it wasn't a question of belief or superstition. They were living with a direct awareness of the world being full of these spiritual beings. An invisible reality was interpenetrating the visible reality, and that then makes one realize that, I mean, if you really go into it and you accept that was the case, it makes you realize that today our consciousness is incredibly reduced, and we may look with condescension at the past, but we do so at our own peril, because it means that we actually don't realize the extent to which we've become ignorant of things which are actually incredibly important. So Steiner really set me on that path of sort of trying to understand a large historical span of time. It's more or less 5,000 years.
Is the implication then in what Steiner said that we've somehow lost our way, or is that meaningful, the journey that we've taken? I mean, this loss of this broader consciousness you're speaking about.
No, for him it was definitely a meaningful process, which gave us as much as we lost, but in a completely different area, because we became, in becoming more intellectual or head-centered, we also became more free, and free especially of the world of the gods. I mentioned Homer earlier on, if you read how the gods were influencing human behavior in the Iliad, it's quite extraordinary that people, these great heroes, were actually not making their own decisions about what they did, and they weren't taking responsibility for it either. They were listening to what the gods told them to do, and then blaming what they did on the gods. And today we can't do that. And this is something which I think began to change with Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Aristotle in particular, I think, is a major watershed, because he emphasized in his work on ethics the importance of human responsibility and freedom. And that's what we've been living with for the last 2,000 years. And of course it's led us into quite a dire situation today. And I think there's obviously a need to become aware once more of that whole realm of being. And that's what Steiner was saying. And
but it's not a going back, is it then? It's not a return to the past in terms of our consciousness.
It's certainly not a going back, because one can't undo everything that's happened. And also there's huge value in the fact that we're able to hopefully think clearly and objectively today, and also make decisions based on real freedom of choice. Whereas in those days that wasn't really possible. Not as I understand it anyway. Just to give you an example, divination was incredibly important in ancient Mesopotamia and in Greece and in Rome. Before any major state decisions were made, there would be divination either by opening up a sacrificed sheep and looking at the liver, or observing the flights of birds, so on, so that they could tune into the will of the gods. That is simply impossible for us to go back to. We to do so would be a kind of undoing of so much that we value.
I mean, what's your understanding through Steiner, or just through your own pondering on these things, about what the gods might think about all this then? I mean, they've lost their influence.
The gods have had a terribly hard time. The one thing that they want is for us to become aware of them again, and even if we don't become aware of them, to at least acknowledge that there is something beyond what we perceive with the five senses, or through all our amazing instruments and machines.
Would you like to say something about Steiner's warnings about technology? I know this interests you very much.
Yeah. Well, Steiner gave us a very important idea, if you can call it an idea, which is that there are two beings who are influential in human evolution, Lucifer and Ahriman, he called them. And one could think of them as spiritual forces that are at work within the human psyche. The Luciferic being a pull towards ever greater entanglement with our own inner lives and with our egos, and a pull which takes us away from commitment to the earth, to nature. Whereas Ahriman is a being, or whatever you want to call it, an influence within us that would like to tie us into the material world and kind of trap us there, so that we don't see anything beyond what's just material. And
so there are two polarities, are they?
Definitely two polarities, and the side of the polarity which is particularly influential today is the Ahrimanic side, and we see that both in materialistic science and also in the growth of technologies, and especially, I think, in the digital revolution, which is technology driven by a sort of reduced, a drastically reduced kind of thinking, which has been captured by machines and, in a sense, locked into machines, which made them incredibly clever. If you look at the way the computer developed from the 17th century through the 18th, 19th centuries, there was a long period of preparation in which incredibly intelligent, clever people, mostly mathematicians and logicians, were trying to work out how it would be possible to encase rational thought within a machine, a physical machine. And the first person to do it was actually Pascal, the 17th century, and then towards the end of the 17th century, Leibniz produced another mechanical calculator, so they were called at that time. And for Leibniz, his mechanical calculator was actually the prototype of a computer. He was very clear about it, that he thought that this was a machine that could be developed into a thinking machine. So that in the end, all philosophical questions could be resolved by simply translating them into a language that the machine could function with, which would be a mathematical, logical language. And the machine itself would do a calculation and come out with the right answer. So he looked forward to this time when philosophers would say, well, let us calculate the answer to this particular question and just get the machine going, and out would come the right answer. So this, one could say, is a very Ahrimanic way of doing things. And I think there's a need really for us to realize that computers, they are wonderfully clever and helpful, useful machines, which I think there's absolutely no point in trying to be critical of them. But what we have to do is defend ourselves from them so that we don't get overtaken by them or sucked into the type of mentality with which they function.
Do you mean there's a danger that we become like the computers then ourselves?
There's a very great danger, yes, that computer thinking becomes the standard of thinking. And one can see that's happening. If you just look at the way government departments are run, and I think the whole world of business is now set up to run on computer-compatible models of organisation and thinking.
And in education too, and testing and...
In education too, yeah. It's I think it's very important that an independence of really the human spirit from the computer is cultivated, and one can do that through I think especially cultivating the arts, through poetry, through music, live music, playing music, singing, through actual painting, through actual writing poems, also through simply going out walking in nature, because one of the curious things about computers is that they've actually led us away from relationship to nature. It's quite extraordinary that I read an article about a couple of years ago, which was saying that children just 20 years ago were spending much more time outside than they are today. And that's because of the influence of computer games and so on. So in education, I think one of the most important things that can be done in education today is actually to equip children to be able to meet the world of computers and electronic technology as independent, free human beings, so that they're not overwhelmed by it and sucked into it. The danger of the Luciferic tendency is that it leads us away from the earth. The danger of the Ahrimanic tendency is that it leads us away from awareness of the spirit, so that we become trapped in a kind of materialistic worldview. But both of them also have a gift, and one could say that the Luciferic tendency has given us our self-consciousness, self-centeredness even, and also inspiration, artistic inspiration. One could put that at the door of the Luciferic tendency, and thank Lucifer for that. The Ahrimanic tendency has given to human thinking an analytic crispness and clarity, which has meant that rational analysis has become extremely fine and also extremely helpful for I suppose the development of civilization as we know it. So both of them bring their gifts, but they also bring their negative tendencies, which if we go too much in one direction or the other, then we can lose our humanity. And I think in some ways they're both beneficiaries and they're also opponents. Which is interesting if you think of Jacob and the angel, how he had to struggle with the angel. And then the angel blessed. And I think we have to struggle with both Lucifer and Ahriman, and particularly today with Ahriman, in order to win a blessing from him.
And for Steiner, of course, the figure of Christ is crucial in this, as a representative, as it were, of what the human being can become.
I don't think we have the strength to really deal with either of those powerful tendencies without finding the centre of love in us, or compassion, which is the Christ centre. Yeah, Christ is crucial, really. But of course one has to be careful about names, and very often people get put off by the very word Christ. But I think if you just think of the being of love, then that's easier to sort of form a relationship with, for a lot of people anyway.
I think one way I've heard Steiner's message described is that it's the challenge for the human being to find love in freedom.
Very nice. Yeah. It's just because we've grown so separate from each other in a way that we have to find that capacity of love in order to reach out consciously towards each other again with self-sacrifice. I don't think you can avoid that. In the past, in the far past, actually in the not so far past, human communities were so much more coherent, and people really felt they belonged to their local village or town, or earlier on tribe. And today we've all become such individuals. It's really important that we develop love, or else we'll just become so centered in our own egos that we will end up going our own ways and end up not being able to speak to each other. Which is probably an Ahrimanic and Luciferic together tendency. You can see it's very strongly at work today, I think.
Are you optimistic?
Of course, you have to be optimistic. And there's so much good that is going on, it just doesn't get reported, but there's a lot of good and a lot of good people who are really trying to bring their love in whatever way to what they do in the world.
Jeremy, the film is called The Challenge of Rudolf Steiner. What do you see as the essence of that challenge? What do you understand by that title? What's the challenge?
Gosh, Rudolf Steiner challenges us to be more conscious and also I think to ground our consciousness in the warmth of heart, and I feel one of the most important things about Steiner is actually that he encourages us to bring thinking and feeling together, so head and heart together, so that thinking is warmed and the heart is informed. Those two things.